All right, we're live. Awesome. So thank you everybody for coming to the first lecture this semester. Bethany Klunder, who's interning in the library, is responsible for the virtual lectures this semester. She'll be doing the introduction and taking questions later on. All right, so I'll turn it over to Bethany.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming again. Today we have with us Ken Arkind, who some of you might already know from the dynamic duo poetry slams that he's done on campus before with Panama Soweto. And Ken is also the executive director of an independent literary arts organization located in Denver called Minor Disturbance. And through this organization, Ken and other poets advocate and encourage youth to use poetry and performance with classes, programs, and slams in the metro area. Performing poetry allows people to develop a deeper understanding for one another and have positive change in the local community. Today, Ken will be discussing his experiences with minor disturbance and the use of performance poetry as a teaching tool. And at the end of the talk, there will be an opportunity for questions. So make sure you guys think of something. And with that, please join me in welcoming Ken.
Hello, everyone. Hey, this is my co-host, Mario. Hello. This is actually a Mario Brothers energy drink. I don't know who came up with that idea, but it's kind of terrifying, and I'm never going to drink it. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you put your arms up and go like that? Can everybody give me like a crazy arm? Yeah! That's awesome. Okay, cool. So, a couple of warnings real quick before we get started. Sometimes I get really excited and passionate, and that causes me to talk very quickly. And so if I end up going too fast, someone just do that arm waving thing and let me know that I'm getting crazy, and I'll chill out. Second thing is that sometimes I speak too slow because I am simultaneously a child and an old man at the same time, and I'm probably going to yell into the microphone a few times and get up close because I don't understand technology. That being said, too, I'll jump to conclusions sometimes because this is a very specific topic to be talking about, and sometimes I forget that other people don't have the same base level of knowledge about this weird little world of poetry as an arts education tool. With youth or slam specifically. So if I skip something, just at the end, once again, there's a Q&A. Remind me of what I forgot to say, and then I can explain again. That also being said, there's a lot of ground to cover in the next 30 minutes. So I'm just gonna jump right in, and hopefully it all works out for the best. Awkwardness is my spinach. It's what keeps me powerful. So every once in a while, I'm just going to get distracted by myself and make weird faces in the camera because I'm a child. If I do that, make faces back, it makes me feel less alone. All right? Everybody cool?
Yep.
Sweet. Awesome. So primarily what I wanted to talk about, and this is my other warning too, I'm only going to say pedagogy once or twice. It is an overused word. Is everybody familiar with the word? It basically means, the philosophy of teaching. But people use it a lot to sound fancy, and I think that's silly. But that's primarily what I'm going to talk about, is how I approach this work and where I come from, and and in order to do that, I have to give you some background information because this subject is very specific, like I said before. So, like Bethany said, my name is Ken Arkind. I'm proud to be from Denver, Colorado, and for the last 8 years, I've made my living as a professional poet and author. I started this when, the first thing I'd like to say about it too is that it's important to point out that I'm not a teacher or an educator by trade specifically. I'm an artist who got into teaching because I cared about young people, and I wish that I had this opportunity when I was younger. So I work very hard to create these kinds of spaces. That being said, I have the utmost respect for people that approach this work as a straight educator. It's something that I am learning slowly to do, and teachers are what saved my life. And so I appreciate all of them and the work that they do. And that's the last time I'm going to say something corny like saved my life. So I started as an artist. I was lucky enough to win a poetry slam, the National Poetry Slam, in 2006. An agency saw myself in Panama, Soweto, and picked us up and started representing us to tour colleges and universities. Since then, I've been a part of several groups, and I do a lot of solo touring as well. I've won a National Poetry Slam. I've been lucky enough to have 2 books published. I performed in 49 states and 7 countries. And somehow, magically, I got involved in the teaching artist work. And outside of running Minor Disturbance specifically now, I teach 4-credit spoken word classes in several alternative high schools in Denver public schools, including Lincoln and Venture Prep. Really, all of this comes, though, from me being a crazy punk rock kid who got to yell his poems at his friends at house parties. And that's still kind of primarily what I do. By show of hands, how many people here are familiar with Poetry Slam? Okay, a decent amount. Quick refresher, Slam was a game that was invented in the mid-1980s by a construction worker named Mark Smith, who wanted to get people interested in poetry. So he invented a game in which random people from the audience are selected to be judges, and they judge the poets on a scale from 1 to 10 using decimal points. Poetry Slam Incorporated is the national body that governs Poetry Slam. They're kind of like the NFL for nerds. And they run several national tournaments, and that rule of randomly selected audience members is carried through even at the national level. So that means at a final stage, when you have 2,000 to 3,000 people in an audience, the judges for those finals teams are still random members from the audience, which shows you how incredibly silly and totally subjective the idea of a poetry slam is. It's not important. It's just a game that we play. Some people are particularly good at it. That's cool. Some people are particularly good at making breakfast burritos, like myself. What's important is the art and the fact that people are interested in it. And so the lasting legacy to me of the Poetry Slam is certainly its use as an arts education tool. And that's where Minor Disturbance comes in. So the organization that Bethany mentioned, it's also important to know, and this is actually probably the most important thing about Minor Disturbance, is that I was not the founder. Minor Disturbance was actually founded by a youth poet from Denver named Jacob Rosen. And our organization has always been and will always be by youth and for youth. The reason I got involved was that in 2006, Jacob put the slam together, the event, and had a bunch of competitions to decide the members of a team, a youth poetry slam team, just like they have for the adult National Poetry Slam, that would go do a youth National Poetry Slam called Brave New Voices. They did a TV show about this on HBO. Maybe some of you guys have seen it. But he really desperately wanted to go to this event. And so when you have a slam team, often they have coaches. And that's where I came in. And I was asked to be the coach for that youth team. So we went to the Brave New Voices International Youth Poetry Slam, which that year happened to be in New York City. It was the first year we went, which was 2006. We had a fun time. We did okay, but either way, we had a really fun time. And when we came back, all of the youth that were involved in the program voted me in as the director. Perhaps it was my sweet beard. Perhaps it was the fact that I don't really do much with my free time besides write poems. But either way, they asked me to come be a part of this, and so my life kind of got consumed by that. In that time, we built it into a fully fledged into a full program. Our mission statement, which I have memorized being an executive director, is we are an independent literary arts organization dedicated to helping Colorado youth find voice through the mediums of poetry and performance. It is very much our belief that poetry is a communal art form, and that its best use is in bridging other cultures and backgrounds and human beings together. So since that time, we've done pretty well. We've gone to 9 Brave New Voices, and we've won pretty much every local poetry slam that you can, whether that competition was adult or youth. We specifically have our young people compete against adults, not because we want to prove that you can beat adults, but that it takes away, it demystifies the competition and takes away the scary aspect of doing it and shows how silly it really is. And if anything, the reason why we've been successful in Slam is because we don't care that much about the competition. It's all about creating the art and everything that comes with that. That being said, I was recently told by someone that we might be statistically the most successful Slam team at Brave New Voices. We've finished in the top 5 the past 6 years, made final stage every single one of those years, and we've won it in 2012 and 2013. That's for better or for worse. It's cool to win, but the moments we've been the most proud of are actually been the moments where we've broken the rules and kind of messed with messed with the competition itself, and I'll talk about that in a second. We also have several programs within the city, including outreach and partnerships with about 50 to 60 different high schools and juvenile detention centers and residential treatment centers. Those are ongoing and off, some longer than others. We run the Denver Public Schools Interscholastic Poetry Slam, which is a bunch of high schools that all have slam clubs in their schools, and they all compete to make it on their teams, and then those teams compete at a local event, which is honestly the goal of that is to try to recreate the excitement of the Brave New Voices experience at home. We're concentrating much more on that. We also started the first official Denver Youth Poet Laureate in partnership with our local city government, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, but it's a program we're really excited about. That being said, I get to have a lot of fun with this because it allows me the chance to create more programs, to come up with curriculum and just activities that in general exist specifically to get young people interested in poetry and empowering themselves, which is cool. But when I go back to the rebellion aspect, the part where the lasting effect of this kind of work comes in is not in the cultivation of young poets, but primarily in the cultivation of young leaders. Or whatever it is that they want. For instance, recently there's been a lot of school walk routes across the country that are involved with what was happening down in Ferguson, Missouri, and a lot of young people have been taken to the streets themselves and protesting. Out of the three out of the 6, and I love this. Some people may not, but 3 out of the 6 high school walkouts in Denver Public Schools were actually orchestrated by Denver Minor Disturbance Youth Team members. Also, a specific story, if anybody had seen the Brave New Voices special on HBO, there was a moment called 7 is the New 10. In that competition, we found out the year previous that the scoring system with the random judges is actually it's fixed in a way at the Brave New Voices Festival. Normally, judges can score poets between 1 and 10, but there's a mandate that judges have to sign at Brave New Voices where they can only judge the poets between 8 and 10. They do this to encourage participation, number one, and also because they were of the opinion that young people couldn't handle a low score, that it helps them feel better. This upset the Denver squad when they found out about this. So the next year they had a promise that if they made final stage, they would read a poem about why they don't believe in that. It turned out that year in 2010, when we did make final stage, was a year where HBO was filming the finals, and they actually brought in celebrity judges who had the same traditional criteria as the other judges, but these judges included Rosario Dawson, Penn from Penn and Teller, Talib Kweli, the hip hop artist. Common was the host of the event. Anyway, what happened is that the youth got up on stage. They turned their microphones directly to the judges and told the judges that if they respected all of the work that had gone on during the slam, that they would give this poem a 7, knowing full well that those judges signed a contract saying they would not give that poem a lower score than an 8. It worked well. They got 3 7s and a standing ovation from the audience, and honestly proved a point that they believed in. That idea of that kind of rebellion and standing up for yourself is honestly why we do this, even at the cost of ourselves. Another example was in 2006, the first year we went to Brave New Voices. There was an anti-war march that was taking place down Broadway that year. There was around 16,000 people strong. They were aware of it and wanted to participate. The issue was at the same time there were the required workshops at the Brave New Voices International Youth Poetry Festival that were happening at the same time. And you have to go to these workshops, or otherwise it jeopardizes your participation in the tournament the next year. The youth decided, honestly, that if they were going to practice what they preach, they should march. And so they wrote a letter and said, at the cost of us and our participation, we believe this is something that we want to do. These are not my politics. These are their politics. They chose to do it. It was the same thing with the 7 is the new 10. I told them, if you do this, you're going to throw the competition. We're not going to win. They thought that making the statement was far more powerful, obviously showing that the competition is not that important, so don't coddle us. It was pretty exciting. James Cass, who's a man who I respect immensely, is the executive director for Brave New Voices and Youth Speaks, was a little upset, but I'm sure he understands. And it was funny. And they got a standing ovation from Malcolm Jamal Warner, you know, from The Cosby Show. That was pretty funny, I thought. Next part, any questions so far? Really cool? We savvy?
What's the criteria in judging at the Brave New Voices?
It's whatever you want. It's honestly entirely up to the audience, to the judges themselves. You can break it down between performance and poetry. You can judge in any way, shape, or form you see fit. So there's no major criteria, and that's kind of what makes it cool and shows that it's really silly. And that kind of goes back to how I approach teaching, because at the end of the day, my experience as a teacher and a facilitator in any way, shape, or form goes back to being a slam coach for a poetry team, which is a very specific a skill set. I didn't know what forensics was when I was a kid. I had no idea. I was too busy getting into fistfights and mostly losing them. I didn't know what speech and debate was. If I had those opportunities when I was younger, maybe I would have taken up on them. But it works similarly. But approaching poetry as performance is very different than other art forms. And I'm going to give you a quick list of things that I believe when it comes to teaching, and they kind of go back to that. First off, the conversation directs itself in the work. In a classroom, the space of having conversation and having open dialogue between the students, I think, is the most important thing that you can do. Lecturing like this is cool when you're simply trying to gain information, but when in practice, I'm very much of the belief that it all comes from the conversation. That goes back to the slam team as well. Poetry, at its heart, is a communal art form. I believe that entirely. We have this misconception over the past 150 years or so that people think that poetry is the solitary thing you do, where you just simply write, and then you put it on a piece of paper, and nobody appreciates you or reads it until you're dead, and then someone studies it later. And I definitely think poetry is alive and well, and I'm going to get a bit more into that and why I believe that. 3, I believe in teaching up. Always teach up. By the time you're 14 or 15, you've spent a lot of your time with people pointing at you while they're standing and you're sitting. And I think talking down to anybody is a bad idea. And this is not to say that I'm not trying to say that people are disrespectful for creating a lesson plan or something that is for people who are not as experienced with an art form or a subject. But I do believe that with young people, it's very important to sit with them and speak, and to come at them as an equal. And that, from my standpoint, when I was younger, allowed me to respect people a lot more. We demonstrate this in our workshops. We run independent workshop series that have been going on for 7 or 8 years with minor disturbance. And even though they're youth focused, and we specifically ask youth to come to them, and in some of our classes make them come, but we also encourage adults to come in. The workshops are all ages, and when you have, and this is very empowering to a lot of young people, because they find themselves in a space where perhaps there's a poet from Denver that they adore. Maybe there's a Panama Soweto in the room, and that's someone who they really respect, and that person is taking the exact same lesson plan as them and experiencing the exact same poems or writing with them at the same time. So that what that does is that it makes it a level playing field, and it creates a level of confidence that's not always present when you have a teaching down kind of method. 4th, I don't believe in defining poetry for other people. That's just me. I know there's definitions of it, but from where I come from and the kind of teaching that I do with young people, when you force a definition, it honestly ends up creating a barricade. And I just simply don't think you should do that. Because it can handicap someone's ability to understand what's going on, and it serves nothing. Whatever poetry is, I know that it's bigger than myself or anybody in this room. It's funny, this room, not that room. It's funny, it's bigger than anybody in this room, and so therefore I think it's difficult to define it, especially when it's something that is so incredibly in tune to the human experience. So the way a classroom I treat a lot like a slam team, in the sense that, well, it's the same kind of theory, honestly. If you look at it, a slam team is kind of like a think tank, right? So the kids compete every year to make it on this team. Once they make the team, the top 6 are in, and they spend the next 3 months writing poems, practicing those poems, and getting ready to perform them in competition or otherwise. And these are often group pieces. So you have multiple people reading the same poem at the same time. And this process, oftentimes when the people make the team, they all come from incredibly diverse backgrounds and have never worked with each other before. For instance, last year's team was, we had a young lady from Park Hill who went to East High School. We had a young lady who's a Western Shoshone who is from South Denver and grew up on a mesa. We have another young person who is from Northside Denver, from a very proud Chicano heritage. And you have a young lady from Denver School of the Arts who comes from a very privileged background. So you have an incredibly diverse group of people who normally wouldn't have anything that brings them together besides poetry. And if anything, that's what this does, and what minor disturbance specifically concentrates on, is the idea of bridging those barriers and that may have been placed on people by society or otherwise, and allowing them to find common ground through poetry. So at the end of that, you're hoping that they have multiple group pieces where they all believe in a subject and they're all reading them. And so in a classroom, you kind of approach it very much in the same way. You don't know where all of those young people came from, and they all have very different experiences and very different backgrounds, and you're asking them to do something very intimate, which is explore their feelings and their ideas, and so you have to create a very safe space in order for them to do so. In a slam team, you have 3 months, basically, to put together a perfect album from 6 musicians who worked very hard to be in that space. And then you as a coach, your job is the producer. I'm the record producer. So I help guide them in creating their artwork and then giving them performance tips. So it's a very similar space. The thing, too, that's important about it, too, is that on the slam team, for about the first month, we don't write anything. We just have conversations. We just talk about where we're from and our backgrounds and what we believe in. And sometimes there's arguments, and sometimes there's, pillow fights, and sometimes there's random dance parties, or anything. It go and dragons. Sometimes there's dragons. And so that first month is very important about learning about each other and about breaking down those barriers and having those conversations. And so when we teach, honestly, with a lot of the environments that I find myself in, the first 40 minutes of a 60-minute period, there is no writing. There's discussion. There's spaces where I convince people that they can write, and there's a lot of icebreakers. We play a lot of games. And that's not always necessary in institutions of higher learning, but specifically where we are, for lack of a better term, on the front lines, getting people interested in doing this or understanding for the fact that they can is hard. And I think it's important, too, the approach is that we're not teaching young people to write poems. We're reminding them that they already do, because everybody does that. Storytelling is one of the most important aspects of being a human being. That brings up an idea of the idea of being in an intimate space with young people and having them write poems. There's this conception that using poetry as art therapy, which is fine, but that's something very specifically that we don't do. The simple act of speaking to each other and talking about things and then just writing the poem and being given the tools to write the poem, everything else is inherent in that. The therapy just comes with that. It's not something you have to actively seek out. And I personally believe, and this is just my opinion, I think there's a danger that's inherent in that, especially when working with particular groups of young people. There's a lot of times in classes where I've had young men in my schools who have said, I don't want to write about my past. And they don't have to. And they don't necessarily express that in the sense of like, I don't want to write about my past. They'll just not participate. And that's for many reasons. You know, it's culturally tough for them to be vulnerable. It's culturally tough for them to be vulnerable in some cases, and it's one of those things where you don't want to force anybody to write about anything they don't. So a lot of our lesson plans don't concentrate on like digging deep, which is something that we do in a lot of writing workshop spaces. A lot of what we do is just concentrate on having fun. The digging comes with that. If I ask a young person to write a poem about an orange unicorn or video games or something absolutely ridiculous, there's going to be some kind of inherent therapy or fun that comes along with that. And if they want to be intimate, that can come, or personal, or talk about big issues in their lives, that can come later. Specifically, what we're trying to do is just allow a safe space. And by automatically jumping in and saying, yo, you got to dig deep and find the darkness, you know, or something like that, you're going to automatically create a space where they don't feel safe telling these stories. They don't feel safe wanting to do that. And it's funny about that, too. You can often see the young people because during the discussion period, when you're just talking about things, like I have a nerd workshop that I like to do a lot. That's a lot of fun, where we just talk about how are you a nerd, and how do you define a nerd, and what is something that you're nerdy about. And it's great because these young people will find themselves in a space where they're telling these amazing stories and suddenly all relating to each other and be like, yeah, do you ever play Mario Brothers? Yeah, man, you remember like the last level where you got to jump over the bricks, and like, oh yeah, blah 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 blah. My older brother had that, and all these stories come out, and those stories, whether they know it or not, that's that moment where they're reading poems. They're reading poems to each other, and whether they're scared to hold a piece of paper because suddenly that makes it official, and that actual act is terrifying. But just the actual storytelling, when you have a safe space, they don't realize that they're writing those poems. And it's funny too, because later you'll be like, dude, just write down everything you said. And even taking that step is difficult for them. Even if they just told the whole story to you in person by telling a story, to actually write it down is terrifying sometimes, because it gives it credence, it gives it power, it makes it permanent. So that's 60% of the work that I end up doing in classrooms is literally getting them to be above that space. And honestly, I have more fun in the fun workshops. I like hearing their stories about being a nerd, about being goofy, or you know, their favorite cars, or you know, that's literally where the work ends up coming. I think catharsis is something that we don't have to push. It comes with it. Any questions about that real fast? Because I want to get into something else. We savvy? You're all very fashionable. Thanks for letting me speak to you. So I guess a lot of that comes down to as to whether or not this kind of work is important. Someone brought up a subject a while ago at a talk I did, where they were asking if why would you be teaching people poetry when the world needs more engineers to help solve its problems? And my personal belief is that you can be both of these things. I don't understand when poetry had to specifically be its own thing. Poetry is the art form that we use to translate other art forms. How can you truly describe music or painting without poetry? I think we cannot communicate without it. Poetry is the art of trying to say things with words that cannot be said with words, and therefore it's the most universal form of education of communication that we have. I think its job then is to break down those spaces where we're afraid to say things. And I think that in and of itself makes it important. To give you an example of that, I'm going to talk very briefly about a workshop that I do that's just loosely called the Slang Workshop. And what happens is, and this helps me too also as I'm getting older, as an aging hipster, to understand some of the language that goes on in my classroom. So the way the workshop works is we have a conversation, we watch a couple poems, usually something by Joshua Bennett, and he has a poem called 16 Bars for Kendrick Lamar that's amazing. And we'll talk about slang. We'll ask people to define slang. And 9 times out of 10, the definition that usually comes up for slang is a word that's not a real word that we use to communicate. And then you ask them, what's a real word? And they say, well, if it's in the dictionary, then it's a real word. And that's not always true, and there's a lot of discussion goes around comes with this, but you know, for the sake of timing and levity, I'll just leave it at that. And they what we'll do is we'll start talking about slang terms that people use and say, like, okay, so fresh or dope or ratchet. These are words that, you know, and we write all of them on the board. I know I see a couple of people laughing because I said ratchet. That word is funny. And usually I ask them what's the definition of ratchet, and they'll say Miley Cyrus. I'm like, no, it's not. We can talk about that later. But so you're writing, we collect as many slang terms as we can, maybe 12. And this is the challenge I present them with. What I ask them is like, how many people in the classroom use these words? And most of them use it. Every once in a while, this kid who's like, I never use any words like that. And they're funny because they do. But so you ask them all these different terms. Then you ask them to define these terms. Specifically, define ratchet for a person who has never heard the word ever before in their life. How do you give them the most clinical, scientific, straightforward definition? For instance, you ask them, how do you define dope? And they'll say, well, dope is cool. It's like, no, you can't use cool. That's a slang term, which is frustrating because it's incredibly difficult for you to suddenly have to communicate what these words actually mean, to actually give them a definition outside of the context in which you use them. And there's a lot of cultural things that come along with this too, especially when it comes to dialects and appropriation, and those are very real subjects that go on in the classroom. But we try to define as many of these words as we can. The next challenge and the next step of this is I ask them to write a short story using these terms, the slang terms, not the definition. And they write out these definitions, or they write out their stories, and they're usually not very good and silly and about going to a party or something like that. And it's difficult to write because you're suddenly forced to use these words that you just naturally use. There's a lot of critical thought that goes into this, which is a term that teachers love, and I do myself. And so they share these stories. Everybody laughs because they're really silly. And then I challenge one person to come up to the board. And now, and you're going to read the story again, but instead of reading it with the slang terms, I want you to read it with the actual definitions, which is hilarious. So instead of saying like, we went to this ghetto party, there were all these ratchet people who were sitting around chilling, you have to say, we went to this party in a neighborhood of ill repute where there were a bunch of people who have very low standards of behavior who were just spending time with each other without any expectations. So this is very funny, and it also proves that the importance of slang, and the goal of the lesson plan is very much to say, listen, you don't control, language doesn't control you, you control language. Definitions change all the time. And it's one of those lesson plans that hopefully is empowering, and they walk away from it. There's no great product with this. You know, they don't walk away with a straight-up poem, but the action in and of itself is what's important. And I think that's the other thing about this work that's confusing to some people, especially as it grows, because using Poetry Slam as a youth empowerment tool at this point is becoming pretty widespread, and that's a good thing. But people have misconceptions that we're trying to train future poets and artists, and that's cool if that happens, but that's not the point. The point is for them to get what they can from this, to become future leaders, to use these skills in a million different ways, and to understand that poetry is necessary and that you can use it to become a better engineer. You can use it to become a better politician. You can use it to become a better doctor. There's a million spaces that this can implement in your life, that this can be implemented into your life. And I'm not sure all the time if the young people walk away with this definition or this idea, but hopefully they do, and I believe that they do. And it's funny too when you find yourself in that space, especially when it comes to politics or other things, is that I've learned over the years that obviously you as a mentor you can't force your ideas on other folks. There's a moment that happened when I was still starting Minor Disturbance back in 2007. I was a cook at a restaurant called City O City. If you ever go there, it's like the skinny jean capital of Denver. It's a very hip vegan restaurant, and a lot of us worked there, and a lot of us had a lot of opinions. And I think my politics are pretty clear, and I wouldn't force them on anybody else. But there was a moment. Michael was the barista, and he and I would open the restaurant together. And I used to like to call these moments mornings with Michael because it was just he and I in a bunch of silence, just working together. And he was a very deep dude. And I remember talking to him because I was upset because the youth team had just been formed, and I was giving them a list of opportunities to go to workshops and open mics and places where they could learn more about what they're doing as artists. And it was for this. There was this film festival that had a poetry component tacked onto it, and they had a workshop that they were offering young people, which was how to use your art for activism. And I read it, and I told them to go. But then when I went back afterwards and checked the fine print under the brochure, it said, "Activism through your art, brought to you by Vitamin Water." So the event was sponsored by Vitamin Water. And 2 years previous is when CocaCola had purchased Vitamin Water. I make a personal decision not to drink CocaCola because I have issues with their company. And I wouldn't force that on anyone else, obviously. But at the time, I was really upset, and I'm like, how could I tell them to go do this? It's going against, all of my beliefs and all these things that we could do. And Michael's like, you need to calm down because your politics are not their politics. And he's right. And at the end of the day, they can take what they want from this, and hopefully they do. Hopefully they take this and they argue with me. Hopefully they show up at my poetry festival and screw with my judging system and make me look silly in front of 1 million people. That's what I think the whole point of this is. To kind of tie it all up, the future is scary. Because my minor disturbance is an organization that is by youth and for youth, and because of our entire staff, our entire staff over the past few years is alumni. There's one other adult that gives advice, and that's Susie Q. Smith, who's an amazing poet. But outside of that, the entire organization right now is staffed by alumni. And in April, we're about to take a pretty major step in which I will completely step down as my position as founding director and step on as a senior advisor, which honestly means I don't do anything but help them, give them advice on how to do their jobs. And we're moving into a full youth board controlled model, which we've never done, and is kind of a new thing for a lot of organizations, but something that we've believed in for the past 9 years. So the entire organization will be run by alumni, the eldest of which is going to be 24 years old. And it's scary, and it makes me sad because this is the one thing that I'm the most proud of, and I love being a part of it, but it's important to do. It's incredibly important to do, and it's time. So I don't know what my future is going to look like with this. I'm excited. I'm going to continue to run the Denver Youth Poet Laureate program, which is a new initiative that we started that is great. The winner of this applications are finished on Saturday, and then we have a month to decide, and we're going to have the inauguration ceremony on March 20th. The winner gets a scholarship, which is the Russell J. Arkind Memorial Scholarship Fund, which was named after my late father. They also win a full book deal from my publisher, and they're going to be asked to engage in actual education reform and civic activities throughout the city. The thing that makes this important as a Youth Poet Laureate is that it gives us a space where we can actually maybe work on change within the local government and use a youth voice to do so, which is honestly the most important thing. It's a very necessary program, and we're hoping to double the scholarship every single year. And so that's kind of what I'm jumping on now. I'm helping run that. And other than that, my goal is to be just like you guys. I got accepted, hopefully, into a new creative writing program, and I'll be a student who gets to tour on the side. So that's pretty much where I come from with all of this, and like I said, I'm nervous but excited, and now I'm gonna make faces at the camera. So thank you for your time. Does anybody have any questions for me so I can rant more? I'm glad I didn't go off on too many stories because I have a tendency to do that.
I do have actually a question. It's kind of irrelevant, but I was wondering why do you not like Coca-Cola?
What was that?
Like, what is your problem with the Coke company?
With which competition?
Coca-Cola. The Coke company. You said that you have.
Oh, the Coca-Cola company. They're actively involved in the assassination of union leaders in South America. They use non-potable water, the recycling programs in India, and they're banned from all government buildings down there. They just have a really big history of silliness. The thing is, it's kind of arbitrary for me to pick particular companies and not pick other companies, and I understand that. But I do still believe that it's important to vote with your dollar. And the thing is, if you support certain companies for their practices, then I believe others will follow suit because their goal is to make money, and if you show them how you're not going to spend your money, they're going to try to figure out how to get it. If you want a great example of that is to watch the current McDonald's campaigns, which are hilarious and awesome, but they're working really hard to try to get that business back right now because they lost, what, 7% last year or 4%, something like that, something massive for a company of their size. And they're learning that people don't want to eat McDonald's anymore. You know, Chipotle is a great model that's fast food that's also sustainable or attempting to be sustainable. So there's ways to get around it, but specifically those are my issues with CocaCola. I can send you some literature if you're interested. You can send me an email.
Alright, cool.
Cool. And you guys can ask me questions about whatever. It doesn't have to be about the education side of things. Or I'll just continue to rant.
Can you do one of your poems for us?
A poem?
Yes, please.
Okay, how many people were at any of the shows that I did at Morningside? Anybody? What's up? Okay, let me think real quick. I'll try to find something. A new one. If you're interested too, this is my shameless plug. I had a book published last year called Coyotes, and you can find it online or order it in at your local bookstore. And I will read this poem from it. Well, this is appropriate. Text messages have become the new carrier pigeons. 1,000 tiny little digital ghost birds scratch in the sky every second. Autocorrect on an iPhone is like a self-righteous friend that means well, but always ends up giving you all of the wrong information. Whenever I'm about to board an airplane, I always text my girlfriend to say, I love you, just in case I end up plummeting to my doom. Once, the phone corrected it to say, I lick you. She responded by saying, my mother just read that. It's going to be an extremely awkward Christmas this year. Twitter is the bathroom stall with a choose-your-own graffiti option. One dude's daily hate speech is another dude's daily affirmation. YouTube is an online digital pharmacy. Kitten videos have become the new cookie dough ice cream. 1,000 hours of fluffy antidepressant to help you get over that last major breakup. I don't speak Tumblr. It's like dubstep music to me. I'm pretty sure I'm too old to understand it, and it kind of makes me nervous. Another thing that makes me nervous is when people poke me on Facebook. That's really weird. Don't do it. If I were to poke you in real life, you would most likely hit me, and I would deserve it. Facebook has kind of become like the new church. It's where the community gathers to hear the news, only instead of crop reports and weddings, it's Farmville requests and relationship status updates. When my friend David, a poet and songwriter from Detroit, died without leaving the password to his Facebook page, his profile remained like a digital tombstone. Not a day goes by without people leaving messages, poems, or pictures on his wall the way one would leave flowers at a gravesite. I often find myself sending messages to his inbox, prayers meant only for his ears, things I never expect to be answered. When we're gone, what tangible life will be left for us? Will all of those servers continue to hum, their tiny lights flickering like candles in the world's loneliest shrine? Who's going to be there to answer all of those unrequited friend requests? Last week, the airplane ride home was so turbulent, it felt like the sky was a pit bull. Every cloud, a jagged canine wrapped around the tiny carcass of our plane as it tossed us this way and that. As soon as we landed, I pulled my phone from my pocket and without looking down, frantically texted my girlfriend, I love you, I love you, I love you. When I looked down, the screen read, I live you, I live you, I live you. She responded by saying, I know. I live you too. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I don't know, that talk a little bit about performance, and a lot of that comes into that and the approach to it in poetry, which some people may not have this approach, but it's something that I desperately believe in and that I've used as an educator, not only with the youth slam team, but I'm also the head coach for, is anybody familiar with Poetry Out Loud? It's an NEA program. Yeah. So I've been the NEA, I've been the Poetry Out Loud coach for the state representative of Colorado, and I've helped them with their programming here for the past 4 years. And that's a difficult thing to do because what they're asking young people to do is to recite a classic poem, and what the judges are looking for is for you to perform this poem by like a 300-year-old dead English guy as though you just wrote it today or you're having a conversation. So it's a very difficult thing to do, but with our coaching style, it's kind of fit very well. Because I believe that the poem tells you how to perform it. You know, the words are there. You wrote it. You just have to be brave enough to actually follow it. And especially if you know your poem super well, if you have that thing memorized to the point where you don't even think about it, you can just jump into it, that's important. And when I pick up this phone, I'm going to use different muscles than when I pick up Mario, right? You know, like I'm going to do different things. So when you read a poem in a different space, it should be performed differently. And that can make a lot of my work can be rather, unless I'm yelling into an iPad like I just was, which is awkward, but a lot of times my work can be very conversational, sometimes too conversational. And that's fine with me. That's just how I approach it. But I think that actual act of going inward and pulling the poem out of your body is where a lot of that supposed catharsis that educators are looking for really, really exists. I think in that space, the poem becomes a living, breathing thing, just like poetry. This is a challenge I'm gonna challenge everybody to. How many people here are English majors or for studying creative writing? Okay, I see my crew. I knew you when you walked in. And then, but for other people, I'd like to challenge you on this too. I'll ask you to spend an entire day just observing your day. Write about everything you did and every interaction you had. And then I want you to look at that and honestly ask yourself what it would be like if there wasn't some form of poetry in it. If it was poetic device, if it was just a simple interaction, if it's something that you read, if it was the way a sign was constructed, anything. I challenge you to go throughout your day without poetry and see how incredibly awkward it actually is. I do a similar challenge to young students when I talk about politics. To write politically is simply just to be observational, to just walk through your day and write about it. And I guarantee you it's going to be nearly impossible for you to separate the poetry from the politics from your day. Just watching the way somebody sits at a bench and doesn't sit next to somebody else, that in and of itself is political and social. And there's this idea, I think, and especially in the academy, a lot of the times where politics and poetry shouldn't mix, and I think you don't have a choice but to mix them. I think Donna Gershon is an author, and she has a quote. A lot of people have similar quotes, but it's the one that I remembered. She said, "Politics and philosophy are always personal things." And I don't think you can separate one from the other, and I don't think you should ever have to. And if anybody ever tries to make you, I think they're just scared. That's my opinion. Any other questions for people?
I have a question. You mentioned how a lot of your teaching strategy comes from being like building a community with your students. So I'd like to know what has been one of your most memorable moments with the students.
Whew, that's tough. It's good though. It's a good question to ask. I mean, it's funny. It changes every day. I think if you're invested in the work you're doing with people, especially in any kind of mentorship, every single day feels like one of those moments. That should at least. If you don't have that moment, you need to work it out. And I think so. In a classroom, well, this was the funniest moment, and I haven't always handled these situations best. Sometimes I'm proven to be as uncool as I actually am. There's a young man who's now 23, who I've been lucky enough to coach as both an adult and a youth poet, because I've coached a couple adult teams. And his name's Hoser. He's one of the best poets in Denver, and he's going to change the world, and I can guarantee it. But I first met Hoser. I don't remember first meeting Hoser. I was doing a workshop at a school that he attended called La Academia, and he was in the back just basically making fun of me. And Hoser speaks Spanish. I don't speak Spanish. And so that happens sometimes where I get made fun of, and I should speak Spanish. And I guess his friends and him were just like kind of clowning me. And I noticed it, so I kind of called him out. I'm like, well, do you think you could read a poem? And he's like, I could totally do that. I'm like, yeah, what can you do? He's like, I can rap. And I'm like, all right, well, then come up here and spit a verse. And it was funny to see him get put on the spot like that. And when I tell this story, it sounds ridiculous. It sounds like I'm on some like Dangerous Minds crap, which is stupid. And there's a lot. I'm going to say this too, and this is for all of my respect with teachers. I think there's you can always tell the dedicated people that want to be doing the work, and that's important, because being a teacher used to be the kind of position in society that was viewed at with the same level of respect as being a doctor or a politician. And unfortunately, at some point, that changed. And I think I think we need to come back to that, and seeing how bad, how much education is failing in America right now. I think there's proof that we need to start treating teachers that way and viewing that job as though it is what it is. And maybe I'm just being defensive over it, but I think there's this when I walk into a classroom, I can definitely tell whether or not I want to be there more than the teacher does. And when I do, it sucks. It can be a very sad kind of space to be in, and you have to work really hard. And I think there's a lot of people who get into teaching because they think it's something they can just do. And I don't think it is. I think it's something you have to work very hard to be in a position of. And the best teachers have worked very hard to do what they do and to be where they're at and want to be there. And 9 times out of 10, those teachers aren't always in the nicest of places. They're in the places where they're needed the most. West Career Academy is a school in Denver that I've taught at, that those teachers are some of the people that I respect the most, and they really go in for their students. And they really work hard. And that's one of the schools where, like, when you're on that game, everybody's on that game. I would find myself going in on my days off and staying for 3 or 4 hours just to work with young people to help them finish their finals, because you want to be there, and all the other teachers want to be there. That being said, going back to this, Hoser came up, and I'm kind of nerdy, and I definitely don't look like the kind of guy that can beatbox, and I most certainly don't look like the kind of guy that can beatbox well or play a harmonica while I do it, which is a trick that I have. And so I did that, which he didn't expect, which threw him off his game, which was hilarious. But then he came at me, and he did really well. And I remember that kid, but 2.5 years later, he shows up as a young man, and just destroys and makes our slam team. And Hoser's gone on to be on HBO. He's given 2 TED Talks. He's been on every national poetry slam final stage you can imagine. He's toured across the country. He was just in a major theater production called Enrique's Journey, which went to Los Angeles. And the other thing about Jose is that the whole time that he was doing all this stuff, the guy has been a single father since he was 15. And he has a beautiful and intelligent and capable young son named JT, who's awesome. And that's the thing about it, is that, I mean, Jose's a very special dude and overcame a lot of stuff. And there's a lot of young people that have that same kind of space, but they don't always go on to be performers or poets. They can go on to do whatever they want. And I don't know. It is what it is. If you're going to sit there and, like, there's, and not to bring them up specifically, but there's this idea of the Teach for America kind of syndrome, which it's not that people who are involved in Teaching America don't do good things, because they do. But there's a lot of people that get involved in it and just sort of show up and think that they're going to, like, save a bunch of inner city kids, and they just end up making, lack of a better term, boobs out of themselves. And I don't think, I think you just want to be there. You have to be there. I think that at the end of the day is it, And I didn't discover or save Jose in any way, shape, or form. Jose didn't need saving. Jose was already on a track to be a badass, and he is a badass. And hopefully, in some way, shape, or form, I helped inform his decisions along that way. You should never take credit for those kinds of things. And I think that's another culture that exists in education. People would take credit for that crap. You didn't do that. The kids did that. You just hung out and helped them. That's it. Same thing with the poem. Any other questions? I'm just going to dance. Yeah.
Any tips on growing an awesome beard?
What's up?
Any tips on growing an awesome beard?
More tips on growing an awesome beard? Don't do anything. The beard will come. And if it doesn't, then maybe it's not meant to be. It's okay. I've had a beard for 10 years now. I had a beard before everybody. What is it? What do they call them? Lumbersexuals, before that was a thing. And I will have the beard when the lumbersexuals go away. This is my face, and I like it. Any more questions? Is there anybody here who's planning on going into education? Good. I didn't scare you off, did I?
No.
Okay, good. And if you have anything, and like I said, I put myself in a space to be challenged. If you don't agree with some of the stuff I said, or if you have some questions about it, please come at me. Come at me, bro. I'm all about it. Yeah?
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you, Ken, for your time.
Thank you guys very much. I appreciate it.
Have a good one.
If you're interested, real quick, if you want any more resources, you can visit us at minordisturbance.org, and you can see the new staff and a lot of the stuff that's going on in some of the young people's poems. If you have any questions, you can email me there directly. So thank you very much. Thank you, Bethany. Everybody be safe.
Thank you.
Bye.